I had just pulled into my driveway after work when I spotted a police cruiser parked by the community pond. My stomach sank immediately. In Oakwood Heights, a quiet and orderly neighborhood, the presence of police usually meant one thing. Our HOA president, Karen Peaton, had found her next victim. As I hurried toward the pond, the sharp edge of her voice carried across the otherwise peaceful afternoon. Seated calmly on his usual bench was Walter Garrison, his fishing rod resting in the water as if nothing around him could disturb his morning routine. At 78, Walter had lived here longer than anyone, his weathered hands steady on the pole even as chaos unfolded. Karen, meanwhile, stood behind the young officer, arms folded in smug authority. She was dressed in her trademark style, a crisp blazer, pressed slacks, and her HOA badge pinned proudly on her lapel like a sheriff's star. Her blonde bob shook with indignation as she pointed dramatically at Walter. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to handle the confrontation. What unfolded that day would eventually strip the HOA of control over nearly $2 million worth of waterfront property. But to understand why, I need to backtrack. Walter had moved to Oakwood Heights in 1992, back when it was mostly farmland and the pond was nothing more than a simple fishing spot. His modest ranch house sat on 3 acres, with the pond forming his eastern boundary. For more than 30 years, his mornings began the same way. Coffee in one hand, tackle box in the other, a quiet stroll to cast his line into the water. Karen, on the other hand, was a newcomer. She had bought her Hillrest Drive McMansion just 2 years earlier. Within 6 months, she'd secured a seat on the HOA board, and within a year she had maneuvered her way into the presidency. From the moment she took power, she launched her campaign to transform Oakwood Heights into what she liked to call a premier residential community. First came the uniform mailboxes, then the restrictive color palette that offered only beige and gray. Landscaping standards followed, forcing residents to maintain pristine, country club-worthy lawns. Her latest mission, however, set her sights on the pond. She announced it would now be considered an exclusive HOA amenity, requiring permits and a $50 monthly fee. The incident began on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning. Walter, as always, had wandered down around 7 a.m., coffee steaming in one hand, tackle box swinging in the other. He'd been fishing for about an hour when Karen stormed down the gravel path in a tailored power suit, as if she were headed into a boardroom. In her most authoritative tone, she declared that, effective immediately, pond access required HOA authorization and a paid permit. Walter barely glanced at her, offered a polite smile, and went on fishing. That small act of defiance sent Karen into a fury. I later heard from Janet, who'd been walking her dog nearby, that Karen had stood behind Walter rattling off passages from the bylaws with escalating hostility. When he ignored her, she threatened him with trespassing charges. When he still didn't budge, she pulled out her phone and called 911. By the time I arrived, half the neighborhood had gathered. Everyone knew Walter, and more importantly, everyone was exhausted by Karen's iron-fisted rule. We formed a semicircle around the confrontation, recording the entire exchange. The officer, young and clearly inexperienced, was doing his best to keep things civil. He asked Walter whether he lived in the neighborhood, and Walter simply nodded toward his house, visible through the trees. Turning to Karen, the officer requested her explanation. She launched into a rehearsed monologue about HOA regulations, property rights, and community standards. At one point, she triumphantly waved a manila folder, insisting it contained the documents proving the HOA owned the pond and adjacent land. Her confidence grew as she cited the property's estimated $2 million value. The officer examined her papers, frowning, then asked Walter if he had any documentation of his own. Without a word, Walter reached into his tackle box and pulled out a worn envelope containing his original 1992 deed. Things shifted instantly. The officer made a quick phone call, and the crowd waited in tense silence. Karen smirked, tapping her foot, as if victory were inevitable. But only 3 minutes later, the county clerk confirmed the truth. The pond, along with a 50-foot easement, had never been transferred to the HOA. A clerical error during the neighborhood's incorporation left it under public trust, with Walter's deed specifically tied to access rights. Not only could Walter fish there, but he might be the only resident with formally documented privileges. The HOA had been enforcing authority over land it didn't legally control. Karen's face flushed crimson as she demanded the officer's supervisor, but the damage was irreversible. Neighbors immediately began pulling up the HOA website, calculating the permit fees and fines they'd paid over the years. Questions erupted. Would they be refunded? Did the HOA have any legitimacy in issuing fines? Karen had no answers. Within the hour, 2 county officials arrived. Their investigation confirmed the officers' findings. The HOA's supposed ownership was based on invalid paperwork, and the error carried serious implications for property values and future developments. Patricia Holloway, the no-nonsense lead official, issued a cease and desist order on the spot. The HOA was to halt all pond-related enforcement immediately and return every dollar collected. She further announced a full audit of the HOA's property claims. The final humiliation came when Patricia required Karen to make a public statement, sealing the end of her unchecked reign over Oakwood Heights. Standing beside the pond, with Walter still calmly fishing in the background, Karen was forced to apologize for the misunderstanding. She announced that all restrictions on pond access were lifted immediately. The crowd's reaction was a blend of shock and satisfaction. Some applauded, while others immediately asked Walter if they could join him. Within minutes, the suffocating atmosphere Karen had created began to unravel. That evening, I learned what unfolded during the emergency HOA board meeting. 3 members resigned on the spot, distancing themselves from what they called Karen's reckless leadership. The remaining members voted to hire an attorney to evaluate the HOA's liability, and the results were devastating. Not only did the HOA owe thousands in refunds, but the loss of control over the pond slashed the community's asset value by more than $2 million. The HOA's insurance company launched an investigation into whether Karen's actions qualified as negligence. But the story didn't end with the pond revelation. Months earlier, Walter had tried to warn Karen. After one of her first board meetings, he had approached her with the same envelope he later showed the officer. Calmly, he explained the easement situation and even offered to show her the county records. Karen dismissed him with a wave of her manicured hand, telling him that old-timers like you need to accept that things change. The truth was that Walter's family once owned the original farm where Oakwood Heights was built. When developers purchased the land in the 1980s, Walter's father negotiated specific terms. The pond would remain open to the public, with his family retaining permanent fishing rights. The agreement was clear, filed with the county, and never properly transferred when the HOA was formed. Karen's downfall accelerated once the local news picked up the story. The headline screamed, "HOA President calls cops on elderly veteran, loses $2 million asset." Yes, Walter was also a Vietnam veteran. A fact Karen would have known had she ever bothered to speak with him instead of issuing orders. The insurance investigation uncovered even more troubling details. Karen had been sending cease-and-desist letters to residents about pond use, threatening lawsuits she had no authority to pursue. She collected more than $15,000 in so-called pond permit fees, money that now had to be refunded with interest. Worse, she convinced the board to take out a loan for pond improvements, using the property as collateral, despite the HOA not owning it at all. When residents filed complaints, the state attorney general's office stepped in. They discovered that Karen had been falsely listing the pond as an HOA asset in loan applications and marketing materials, raising the specter of fraud. Her real estate license, which she had used to bolster her credibility as president, came under formal review. The final blow struck at the special community meeting the following week. The clubhouse overflowed with angry residents demanding accountability. The atmosphere was electric, years of bottled frustration finally spilling out. When the treasurer revealed the true financial impact, not only $2 million in lost assets, but another $800,000 in potential liabilities, gasps rippled across the room. Karen attempted to defend herself, claiming she had acted in good faith based on previous board documentation. But as residents recounted her abuses, fining a widow $500 over the shade of her mailbox, threatening to sue a disabled veteran for installing a wheelchair ramp, her support evaporated. When the vote was called, the result was decisive. Karen was removed from the board 12-3. Frozen at the podium, she opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. Then came the second vote, whether to pursue legal action against her personally for negligence and misrepresentation. It passed 198-17. The board's attorney stood and declared that Karen would be held personally liable for damages, potentially exceeding $300,000. The color drained from her face as he explained. Then, when someone shouted that the state was investigating her for fraud, charges carrying fines of up to 50 hours,